Joining me now is Harris Walz campaign spokesman Ian Sams. Ian, thanks for coming on. So what impact do you think Liz Cheney might have campaigning with Kamala Harris? Do endorsements work?
Absolutely. I think that they show that there's building momentum on the Republican side of the aisle and among independents to support Vice President Harris's candidacy. You know, Congresswoman Cheney, former Vice President Cheney, they're just some of the latest Republicans who've come out. We've had endorsements from more than 200 alums of the Bush, McCain, and Romney campaigns and administration for Bush. We've had former Congress people. We've had former Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan. I think that what it speaks to is that the election is really a fundamental choice between people who are putting their country first, people who are patriotic, people who understand that we have our fundamental freedoms and democracy at stake, versus Donald Trump, who just this week we are being reminded left and right of what he did when he was president to try to cling to power and overturn the results of the election, whether it's the facts that we're learning overnight from the recent filing, including his refusal to say anything and just scroll Twitter when the Capitol was being attacked on January 6th, whether he was informed about Vice President Pence being rushed to safety and him saying, so what? J.D. Vance on Tuesday night refusing to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. People are being reminded about the danger that Donald Trump poses to our country and our freedoms every single day. And I think it's leading Republicans, including Congresswoman Cheney, who may not agree on all issues or many issues with the vice president, but who are willing to put country first and understand that the character and the commitment to our Constitution that Vice President Harris has means so much that they're willing to speak out and show the courage to do so.
What's your reaction to Donald Trump's angry denunciation of election interference, that this is all coming from the Justice Department and should not be released this close to the election?
Well, obviously, want to be careful with an ongoing federal case, and in terms of the timing, would leave that to the Justice Department. However, I think that the facts that came to light overnight are the facts that we've known for years, that Donald Trump on January 6th did not speak up to stop the mob, that he encouraged his supporters to try to overturn the results of the election, that he pressured his vice president, that he pressured state election officials to try to overturn the will of the people, something that we have not seen in this country when it comes to the peaceful transfer of power, which is one of the hallmarks of American democracy. That is what is at stake in this election. And I think you'll hear the vice president talk about this tonight when she joins Liz Cheney in Wisconsin, about the importance of having a president who puts country first, who does not put their own ambitions and political interests ahead of the Constitution, ahead of our country. That is such a fundamental difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and is something that I think voters are going to be thinking a lot about over the next 33 days before the election.
Now, you've got 33 days, and you've got all kinds of things happening around the world, not in your control, but you've got the port strike, you've got the Middle East and the possibility of a wider war already, Iran making new threats today against anyone who helps Israel, and divisions in the Democratic Party over help for Israel versus concerns for the Palestinians, and now for the Lebanese who are being evacuated from their homes as well. So all of that, as well as the hurricane and the after effect and criticism in two key states, especially North Carolina, that the FEMA response was too slow. Also in Georgia, states that you've got to win, or really need to try to win. How do you combat all of this? These are circumstances, some of which were beyond your control.
Well, I think the vice president doesn't see these issues through the political prism. I think she sees them through the leadership prism. And I think that when you think about these sort of instances and events that occur, and it raises the measure of the leader. And it says, do we want someone who's serious, or do we want someone who's unserious? Do we want someone who's going to spend their time trying to put the country first and solve problems and get help to people who need it and to de-escalate conflict around the world? Or do we want someone who's going to play politics, who's going to lie and make up claims that aid isn't going to Republican areas that Republican governors across the South have to repudiate, or who spend their time with their thumbs on Truth Social, ranting in all caps about chaos around the world while attacking and dismissing injuries of our soldiers when he was president from Iran as headaches. You know, these are things that really show clearly the contrast in this election between a leader who's serious, who's actually working on people's challenges to try to bring solutions to the challenges that happen, and someone who's only interested in themselves and who wants to take problems and make them worse because he thinks that they are good for him politically. And so when you see these unforeseen challenges that happen in a moment like this, it really puts in front of the country the choice between the two candidates. And with Vice President Harris, as you've seen, she's trying to rush aid to the states that need it most. She's in the Situation Room, working with the national security team to try to de-escalate and avoid a broader conflict. She is working very hard and has worked very hard, I should add, over the last several years to shore up our supply chain to make sure that disruptions don't impact our economy. Well, these are the things that she's working on, and Donald Trump is playing politics with it.
Well, speaking of the politics and the port strike, does the vice president support invoking the Taft-Hartley Act? I know that some leading Democrats have been arguing for this, to have an 80-day cooling off period, despite what you might expect from the labor movement.
Yeah, I think the administration's been very clear, and the president specifically, about his position on not invoking that. The vice president put out a statement just yesterday, I believe it was, a very, very strong statement about the choice in this election between pro-worker and anti-worker Donald Trump. And I think that she is encouraging and she is working to ensure, and working with the administration and the White House, to get people to the negotiating table to work in good faith so that this can be resolved and that we can avoid further economic challenges from it. And I think that she has been very, very clear that what's at stake in this negotiation is the right of workers to benefit equally, or at least some, from massive profits that are going to these corporations, these multinational, international corporations. And the collective bargaining for these workers is something that she believes strongly in, and that they should be able to come to the table, come to a resolution in a way that actually protects and defends workers. At the same time, of course, Donald Trump is saying that workers who strike should be fired. You know, we know where he stands when it comes to labor. We know where he stands when it comes to union negotiating. Sean Fain said it best, he's a scab. And Vice President Harris is trying to bring both parties to a resolution here and actually make sure that the workers are protected throughout this process. So it's a pretty clear distinction between the two candidates in this race.